To pay a debt, her father gave her away. Now she faces a forced marriage with a billionaire CEO. The morning sunlight streamed through the worn curtains of the Hart family kitchen as Ellie stirred a pot of oatmeal on the stove. Steam rose in gentle swirls while she hummed her favorite hymn, finding comfort in the familiar melody. The kitchen might be small and dated, with its faded yellow wallpaper and scratched countertops, but it was filled with love and memories. "A little honey makes everything better," she murmured, drizzling a golden stream into the pot, just enough to sweeten the simple breakfast without being wasteful. Living on a tight budget had taught her to make the most of what they had. Ellie glanced at the small wooden cross hanging above the sink, offering a quiet prayer of gratitude. Times were tough, but their faith kept them going. She smoothed her apron and checked the clock. 7:15 a.m., right on schedule. Her father would be up soon, and she wanted everything perfect for him. The familiar creak of floorboards above signaled her father's morning routine. She smiled, picturing him getting ready for another day at the garage where he worked as a mechanic. Despite the arthritis in his hands, he never complained, always saying God gave him those hands to help others. A sharp knock at the door cut through the peaceful morning like a thunderclap. Ellie froze, wooden spoon suspended mid-stir. Nobody ever came by this early. The knock came again, harder this time, more demanding. "Coming," she called out, wiping her hands on her apron. Her heart skipped as she heard her father's quickened steps on the stairs. When she opened the door, two men in expensive suits stood on their worn welcome mat, looking utterly out of place in their modest neighborhood. Their faces were hard, expressions cold and businesslike. "Frank Hart?" the taller one asked, barely glancing at Ellie. "He's just coming down," she replied, her voice smaller than she intended. Something about these men made her want to close the door and hide. Her father appeared behind her, still buttoning his work shirt. "I'm Frank Hart," he said, his voice steady despite the worry lines deepening around his eyes. "We need to discuss your outstanding debts, Mr. Hart," the shorter man stated, producing a leather briefcase. "May we come in?" The morning dragged on endlessly as voices rose and fell behind the closed living room door. Ellie paced in the kitchen, the forgotten oatmeal now cold and congealed in the pot. She could catch fragments of conversation. Payment schedule, collateral, foreclosure, each word making her stomach twist tighter. The sun was setting when the men finally left, their polished shoes clicking against the concrete walkway. The sound of their car engine faded into the distance, leaving behind a horrible silence. Ellie found her father sitting in his old armchair, staring at nothing. The usual warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by something she'd never seen before. Defeat. Papers were scattered across the coffee table, covered in numbers that seemed to mock them. The evening light cast long shadows across the living room, and Ellie stood in the doorway, watching her father's shoulders slump. His weathered hands trembled slightly as they rested on the arms of the chair. The man who had always been her rock, who had raised her alone after her mother passed, now looked small and vulnerable. The ticking of the old wall clock echoed through the heavy silence. Outside, a neighbor's wind chimes tinkled softly in the evening breeze, their gentle song a stark contrast to the weight that now pressed down on their home. Ellie's heart ached as she watched her father, knowing that whatever had transpired during that meeting had changed everything. The living room lamp cast a soft glow as Ellie brought her father a cup of tea. Frank's hands shook slightly as he took the warm mug, the ceramic clinking against his wedding ring, the one piece of jewelry he'd never pawned, even in their hardest times. "Sweetheart, sit down," Frank said, his voice rough with emotion. "There's something I need to tell you." Ellie settled onto the worn couch, tucking her feet beneath her like she used to do as a child. The familiar position brought no comfort now. Her father's face looked drawn, aged 10 years in a single afternoon. "Those men," Frank began, then stopped, taking a shaky breath. "They're from Wallace Financial. I borrowed money from them last year when the garage was struggling. I thought I could turn things around, make the payments." He pressed his fingers against his temples. "But the interest, it just kept growing." "How much do we owe?" Ellie asked softly. Frank's shoulders sagged. $48,000. The number hit Ellie like a physical blow. Her mind spun, trying to grasp the magnitude. That was more than their annual income combined. "The garage isn't bringing in enough," Frank continued, his voice cracking. "I've been borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, taking new loans to cover old ones. But Wallace Financial, they're not like regular banks. They want their money, and they want it now." Ellie leaned forward, reaching for her father's hand. "What are they threatening to do?" "Everything." Frank's fingers tightened around hers. "The house, the garage. They'll take it all. But that's not the worst part." He looked away, shame evident in every line of his face. "These people, they have connections. They made it clear what happens to people who can't pay." The room seemed to grow colder as understanding dawned on Ellie. These weren't just aggressive lenders. They were dangerous people who operated outside the law. "I've been offered a way out," Frank said quietly, still not meeting her eyes. "There's a job. One night's work. The money would clear everything." "What kind of job?" Ellie's voice trembled. "It's better if you don't know the details." Frank finally looked at her, his eyes pleading. "I know it's wrong. I know what the good book says, but I don't see another way to protect us." Ellie felt tears welling up. This was her father, the man who'd taught her right from wrong, who'd raised her to believe in honesty and faith. Now he was considering something that went against everything he believed in. "There has to be another way," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew their options were limited. Later that night, Ellie knelt beside her bed, hands clasped tightly in prayer. Her bedroom was dark except for the strip of moonlight streaming through her window. The words wouldn't come at first. How could she ask God to help them when her father was contemplating something illegal? "Please," she finally whispered into the darkness. "Show us another way. Don't let Dad do this. He's a good man. He just needs help." Her tears fell onto her joined hands. "I'm scared. These people, what they might do. But I'm more scared of what Dad might become if he goes through with this job." The moonlight shifted as clouds passed overhead, and Ellie remained on her knees, praying for guidance, for protection, for a miracle. The weight of their situation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if faith alone would be enough to see them through. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, but it brought no warmth to the heavy atmosphere. Ellie mechanically stirred her untouched coffee, watching the liquid swirl in endless circles. Her father sat across from her, his breakfast equally untouched, hands folded on the worn tablecloth. "There might be another way," Frank said quietly, breaking the tense silence. His voice was hoarse, as if he'd spent the night rehearsing these words. "One that doesn't involve that job." Ellie looked up, hope flickering briefly in her chest. "What is it?" Frank's fingers tightened against each other until his knuckles turned white. "Yesterday, before those men came to our door, I had a meeting with Lucas Whitmore." "The real estate developer?" Ellie's brow furrowed. Everyone in town knew the Whitmore name. They owned half the businesses in the county. "Yes." Frank cleared his throat. He made an offer. He's willing to clear our debt, all of it." Ellie's hands stilled around her coffee mug. Why would he do that? Because... Frank's voice cracked. He took a deep breath before continuing. Because he wants to marry you. The words hung in the air like heavy smoke. Ellie's mind went blank, unable to process what she'd just heard. What? He's willing to pay off Wallace Financial completely. The garage would be safe. Our home would be safe. We'd be safe. Frank's words tumbled out faster now, as if rushing to justify the unthinkable. He's not a young man, but he's respected in the community. He could provide for you, give you security. Marriage? Ellie's voice sounded strange to her own ears. To a stranger? He's been watching you, apparently. When you volunteer at the community center, at church events, he says he's admired your kindness, your grace under pressure. Frank's face twisted with shame. He approached me weeks ago, but I couldn't even consider it. Until now. Ellie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, their small garden bloomed with the flowers she'd planted with her mother years ago. How many times had she dreamed of her wedding day while tending those flowers? Never had she imagined it like this. How long do I have to decide? She asked, her breath fogging the window. He wants an answer by tomorrow morning. Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I never meant for my mistakes to cost you your future. Ellie stayed at the window for a long moment, watching a butterfly flit between her mother's roses. The sun continued its journey across the sky, shadows lengthening as afternoon faded into evening. Finally, she found herself sitting on the front steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and orange. The concrete was still warm from the day's heat, but she felt cold inside. The choice before her wasn't really a choice at all. She thought of her father's weathered hands, scarred from years of honest work. She thought of the dangerous men who'd stood in their living room, making barely veiled threats. She thought of the illegal job her father was considering out of desperation. Marriage to Lucas Whitmore would save them all. It would keep her father from crossing a line he could never uncross. It would protect their home, their livelihood, their safety. Ellie hugged her knees to her chest as dusk settled around her like a heavy blanket. She understood with painful clarity that refusing wasn't an option, not if she wanted to protect her family. With that understanding came acceptance, quiet and resigned, settling into her bones as the last light faded from the sky. The gleaming glass facade of Whitmore Tower stretched toward the clouds, its 40 stories dwarfing everything else in the modest downtown area. Ellie's reflection in the polished brass doors showed a pale face she barely recognized. Her simple blue dress, though her Sunday best, felt inadequate against the building's oppressive grandeur. Frank placed a gentle hand on her shoulder as they stepped into the marble lobby. Their footsteps echoed across the vast space, past a massive modern sculpture that probably cost more than their entire house. The security guard at the desk gave them a suspicious once-over before checking their names against an appointment list. "Floor 40, he said curtly, gesturing toward the elevator bank. "Mr. Whitmore's executive suite." The elevator rode smoothly upward, its mirrored walls reflecting Ellie's nervous fidgeting. She tried to steady her trembling hands by smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her dress. Her father stood rigid beside her, his tie slightly crooked despite his best efforts. "We can still leave," he whispered, though they both knew it wasn't true. The elevator doors opened directly into a reception area decorated in chrome and black leather. A sleek desk stretched along one wall, behind which sat an immaculately dressed woman who looked up at their arrival. "Mr. Hart and Miss Hart?" Her smile was professional but cold. "Please have a seat. Mr. Whitmore will be with you shortly." They sank into the plush leather chairs, feeling out of place among the expensive, minimalist decor. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the entire city spread out below them like a toy model. Ellie's stomach churned as she thought about how many lives were being lived in those tiny buildings, how many choices being made. How many of those choices were as impossible as hers. The sound of a door opening made them both stand. Lucas Whitmore emerged from his office, and Ellie's first impression was of carefully controlled power. Though in his 50s, he moved with the confidence of a much younger man. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit obviously tailored to his tall frame. His face was handsome in a stern way, with deep-set eyes that studied Ellie with uncomfortable intensity. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Thank you for coming." He extended his hand, and Ellie forced herself to shake it. His grip was firm but not aggressive, his hand cool and dry against her clammy palm. "Please, come in." He gestured toward his office, and Ellie followed him inside, her father close behind. The office was larger than their entire first floor, with a massive desk and a seating area featuring leather armchairs arranged around a glass coffee table. "Sit," he said, indicating the chairs. As they settled, an assistant appeared silently with a tray of water glasses, then disappeared just as quietly. Lucas sat across from them, unbuttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. "I assume your father has explained my proposition?" Ellie managed a small nod, her throat too dry to speak. "Good. Then let me be clear about the terms." He leaned forward slightly. "Upon our marriage, I will immediately clear all debts owed to Wallace Financial. Your father's business will be secure. Additionally, I will set up a trust fund for any children we might have, and ensure you are well provided for in every way." He paused, his eyes never leaving Ellie's face. "In return, I expect a proper wife, someone who will attend social functions, manage our household, and present herself appropriately in public. There will be certain standards to maintain, of course, but I'll provide everything necessary for you to meet them." The clinical way he laid out these expectations made Ellie's chest tighten. She felt her father shift uncomfortably beside her, but Lucas continued, as if they were discussing nothing more consequential than a business merger. "Do you accept these terms, Miss Hart?" Ellie looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. Then, with effort, she raised her eyes to meet his, and nodded once, sealing her fate in silence. The law office of Jensen and Associates occupied a modest building downtown, worlds away from the gleaming heights of Whitmore Tower. Ellie sat stiffly in a leather conference room chair, surrounded by the musty smell of old law books that lined the wood-paneled walls. Her father had insisted on having their own lawyer present, though Mr. Jensen's worn blazer and reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck made him look desperately outmatched. Across the table, Lucas Whitmore's legal team spread out documents with practiced efficiency. Their pristine suits and sleek briefcases marked them as clearly as their commanding presence. Lucas himself sat at the head of the table, appearing almost bored as his lead attorney, Mrs. Crawford, began reviewing the contract. "Article 1 concerns the terms of the marriage itself," Mrs. Crawford stated, her manicured finger trailing down the page. "The union will be legally binding in all traditional senses, with certain specific conditions." Mr. Jensen adjusted his glasses. "Could you clarify those conditions?" "Of course." Mrs. Crawford's tone was clipped. "Miss Hart agrees to maintain the appearance of a traditional marriage, including shared residence and public appearances. She will take the Whitmore name and fulfill all social obligations expected of Mr. Whitmore's wife." Ellie's hands twisted in her lap as the lawyers continued their back and forth. The morning light filtering through the windows seemed too harsh, making everything feel stark and exposed. "Article 2 addresses the financial arrangements," Mrs. Crawford continued. "Upon signing, All debts currently held by Frank Hart to Wallace Financial will be cleared within 24 hours. Additionally, a monthly allowance will be established for Miss Hart's personal use. Mr. Jensen leaned forward. And the trust fund mentioned for potential children? Yes. Article 3 covers that. Papers shuffled. Any children born of the marriage will be provided for through a substantial trust fund, accessible at age 25. Ellie felt her chest tighten at the clinical discussion of potential children. She glanced at Lucas, but his expression remained impassive, as if they were discussing weather forecasts rather than their future family. Article 4 details the conditions of dissolution, Mrs. Crawford said. Should Miss Hart initiate divorce proceedings within the first 5 years, all debt relief will be immediately reversed, with interest. That's rather severe, Mr. Jensen protested mildly. Mr. Whitmore requires assurance of commitment, Mrs. Crawford replied smoothly. However, after 5 years, Miss Hart would retain certain financial considerations even in case of divorce, provided she has fulfilled her obligations under the contract. The morning crawled by as they worked through each section. Ellie's head spun with legal terms and conditions, each one feeling like another bar in an elaborate cage. Her father sat beside her, occasionally squeezing her hand when particularly difficult clauses were discussed. Finally, Mrs. Crawford placed the final document in front of Ellie. If you're ready, Miss Hart, please sign here. She indicated several marked lines with yellow sticky tabs. Ellie stared at the thick stack of papers. Her whole life, all her dreams and choices, reduced to legal language and signature lines. The pen felt heavy in her hand as she lifted it. Wait, Mr. Jensen said quietly. Ellie, are you sure about this? She looked at her father, saw the guilt and worry etched in his face. Then at Lucas, who watched her with that same steady, expectant gaze. Finally, down at the contract that would save her family and change her life forever. With trembling hands, Ellie signed her name on each marked line, the scratch of pen on paper unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The City Hall's fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the worn marble floors. Ellie stood in her best church dress, a simple blue cotton number that suddenly felt woefully inadequate. Her father had helped her pin up her hair that morning, his weathered hands trembling as he tried to secure the bobby pins just right. Lucas wore one of his usual business suits, charcoal gray and impeccably tailored. If not for the marriage license in his hand, he might have been heading to any ordinary board meeting. Mrs. Crawford stood beside him, checking her watch periodically, while Mr. Jensen offered Ellie an encouraging smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Next, called the clerk, her voice echoing through the nearly empty waiting area. They filed into the judge's chambers, where an elderly man barely glanced up from his desk. Marriage ceremony? He asked, shuffling through a stack of papers. Yes, Your Honor, Mrs. Crawford replied, stepping forward with their documentation. The judge nodded, scanning the paperwork with practiced efficiency. Please step forward, he instructed Ellie and Lucas. Ellie's legs felt like lead as she moved to stand beside Lucas. Her father watched from the back of the room, his face a mask of poorly concealed distress. The traditional words washed over her, dearly beloved, holy matrimony, lawfully wedded, each phrase ringing hollow in the sterile office. When it came time for the rings, Lucas produced 2 simple gold bands from his pocket. No engagement ring, no romantic proposal story to share, just cold metal sliding onto her finger with business-like precision. Ellie's hand shook as she placed Lucas's ring on his finger, noting how he kept his eyes fixed on some point above her head. By the power vested in me by the state, I now pronounce you husband and wife, the judge declared, already reaching for the next case file on his desk. You may kiss the bride. Lucas leaned forward and pressed his lips briefly against her cheek. the contact so quick and formal it could hardly be called a kiss at all. Ellie's chest tightened as she thought of all the wedding dreams she'd had as a young girl. The white dress, the church filled with flowers, her father walking her down the aisle. The drive to the Whitmore mansion passed in a blur. Lucas spent it on phone calls, speaking in clipped tones about market projections and quarterly reports. Ellie watched the city fade into the exclusive suburbs, where manicured lawns stretched between gated estates. The Whitmore mansion rose before them, a sprawling stone structure that looked more like a museum than a home. A uniformed housekeeper met them at the door, introducing herself as Mrs. Chen. "I'll show you to your suite, Mrs. Whitmore," she said, and Ellie startled at the new name. Lucas checked his phone. "I have calls to return. Mrs. Chen will see to anything you need." Without another word, he strode away down a corridor, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Ellie followed Mrs. Chen up a grand staircase, trying to memorize the turns through the maze-like hallways. They stopped before a set of double doors. "Your suite, Mrs. Whitmore," Mrs. Chen said, opening the doors to reveal a sitting room larger than Ellie's entire former home. "The bedroom is through there, and your private bathroom is to the right. Your things have been unpacked." With a small bow, Mrs. Chen departed, leaving Ellie alone in the vast space. Her few possessions looked lost among the expensive furnishings. She stood in the center of the room, still in her blue church dress, her new wedding ring catching the light from crystal chandeliers, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. Chapter 7. Learning the Rules. Scene 1. Sunlight streamed through towering windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors, as Ellie ventured out of her suite the next morning. She'd barely slept, tossing and turning in the enormous bed that felt more like an ocean than a place of rest. The silk pajamas Mrs. Chen had laid out for her still felt foreign against her skin. The mansion's corridors stretched endlessly, lined with oil paintings in gilded frames and antique tables bearing crystal vases. Her footsteps echoed no matter how softly she tried to walk. The sound only emphasized the overwhelming silence of the place. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Chen directing a small army of staff as they prepared breakfast. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," the housekeeper said, straightening immediately. "Mr. Whitmore has already left for the office. Would you like breakfast in the morning room or your suite?" "Oh, I can just eat here," Ellie said, thinking of countless comfortable mornings at her family's worn kitchen table. Mrs. Chen's expression tightened slightly. "I'm afraid that wouldn't be appropriate, Mrs. Whitmore. The morning room has been prepared for you." Ellie followed her to yet another immaculate room, where a single place setting waited at a table meant for 12. A butler appeared silently to pour her coffee and serve an elegant plate of eggs Benedict. She couldn't help but think of the simple scrambled eggs and toast she used to make for her father. The morning stretched before her, empty and daunting. She wandered through a library filled with leather-bound books that looked too precious to touch, past closed office doors, and into a conservatory where exotic plants reached toward the glass ceiling. Everything was beautiful, perfect, and utterly lifeless. In one sitting room, she found a piano, its polished surface reflecting the morning light. She reached out to touch a key but stopped herself, afraid the sound would somehow break the mansion's suffocating quiet. Mrs. Chen appeared, as if summoned. "Will you be taking lunch in the garden room today, Mrs. Whitmore? And Mr. Whitmore's office called. He'll be joining you for dinner at 7. Thomas will help you select an appropriate outfit." Ellie's first dinner with her new husband. Her stomach clenched at the thought. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I can dress myself." "Mr. Whitmore prefers certain standards for dinner," Mrs. Chen insisted gently. Thomas has experience with the proper attire. At 6:50, Ellie sat in the formal dining room wearing a black cocktail dress that Thomas had selected. Her hair was swept up in an elegant twist that felt too tight. Lucas arrived precisely at 7, his suit as impeccable as always. "I trust you're settling in," he said, taking his seat at the opposite end of the long table. The distance between them could have fit her entire former living room. "Yes, thank you," Ellie replied softly. "The house is very beautiful." Lucas nodded absently, his attention already on his phone. They ate in silence, broken only by the quiet movements of the serving staff. The food was exquisite, some kind of duck with a sauce she couldn't name, but every bite felt like ash in her mouth. "I'll be in Tokyo next week," Lucas announced as dessert was served. "Mrs. Chen will ensure you have everything you need." Ellie nodded, pushing her untouched crème brûlée around its delicate china plate. This was her life now. Beautiful things, perfect service, and a husband who saw her as just another asset to be managed. She would have to find a way to exist in this gilded cage, to breathe in these silent halls. For her father's sake, she would endure. The familiar brick building of St. Joseph's Academy brought a wave of comfort to Ellie as she walked through its doors the next morning. Here, at least, was something unchanged. The same scuffed floors, the same bulletin boards covered in children's artwork, the same faint smell of chalk and floor polish. Sister Margaret greeted her with a warm smile at the front office. "Ellie, dear, I wasn't expecting you today." The elderly nun's kind face creased with concern. "Is everything all right with Michael's registration?" "That's actually why I'm here," Ellie said, clutching her worn leather purse. "About the payment plan we discussed last month." "Oh, let me pull up his file," Sister Margaret said, turning to her computer. Her fingers clicked steadily on the keyboard, while Ellie shifted in the hard plastic chair, rehearsing in her head how to explain their financial situation. The silence stretched as Sister Margaret frowned at her screen, clicked a few more times, then reached for her reading glasses. "That's peculiar," she muttered. Ellie's heart sank. "Is there a problem?" "Well, not a problem exactly." Sister Margaret adjusted her glasses. "According to our records, Michael's tuition has been paid in full, not just for this year but through graduation." "There must be some mistake," Ellie said, leaning forward. "We haven't—" "No mistake." Sister Margaret turned the monitor so Ellie could see. The payments were processed through the Whitmore Foundation's educational initiative. They began 3 years ago. Ellie stared at the screen, her mind struggling to make sense of the information. 3 years ago, long before she'd ever heard the name Lucas Whitmore, before their debt had spiraled, before everything. "The foundation also covers all additional expenses," Sister Margaret continued. "Books, uniforms, field trips, extracurricular activities. Everything's taken care of." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Ellie gripped the edge of her chair, remembering all the nights she'd stayed up worrying about Michael's tuition, all the extra shifts she'd picked up at the diner, all the times she'd helped her father calculate and recalculate their budget, trying to make the numbers work. "Are you sure?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Sister Margaret nodded, scrolling through the records. "The foundation supports several students at St. Joseph's. It's all very quietly done. They prefer to remain anonymous to the families they help." She paused, studying Ellie's face. "You didn't know about this?" Ellie shook her head, unable to find words. Lucas had been watching over them, helping them, long before he'd ever stepped into their lives. The man who barely spoke to her across the dinner table had been ensuring her brother's education for years. "Well," Sister Margaret said gently, "it seems someone's been looking out for your family." Ellie stood on shaky legs, thanking Sister Margaret automatically. In the school hallway, She pressed a hand against the cool cinder-block wall, trying to steady herself. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in its beam, while somewhere in the distance she could hear children reciting their lessons. Lucas Whitmore, the man she'd thought of as cold and calculating, had been silently supporting her family all along. She stood there, stunned by this revelation, as everything she thought she knew about her new husband shifted like sand beneath her feet. The dining room felt different that evening. The usual oppressive silence seemed charged with unspoken questions as Ellie watched Lucas methodically cut his steak. The long mahogany table between them might as well have been an ocean, but tonight she felt compelled to bridge that distance. Her fork clinked against fine china as she set it down. "I visited St. Joseph's Academy today," she said softly, her voice barely carrying across the expanse. Lucas paused, his knife hovering mid-cut. He didn't look up, but something in his posture changed, a subtle tension that told her he was listening. "I learned something interesting about Michael's scholarship." Ellie's hands twisted the linen napkin in her lap. "About the Whitmore Foundation." The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away several seconds before Lucas finally set down his cutlery. He reached for his water glass, taking a careful sip before meeting her eyes for the first time that evening. "You weren't supposed to find out about that." "Why?" The question came out more forcefully than she'd intended. "Why would you help us, all those years ago?" Lucas dabbed his mouth with his napkin, his movements precise and controlled. "Do you remember the Methodist Hospital emergency room about 4 years ago?" Ellie's brow furrowed. "I worked there part-time during nursing school, but—" "It was a rainy Tuesday evening," he continued, his voice taking on an unusual softness. "My mother had fallen and broken her hip. I was stuck in Singapore on business, and she was alone in the ER for hours." Memory stirred in Ellie's mind. An elegant older woman, clearly in pain, but trying not to show it. "Mrs. Whitmore," she whispered. "I remember her." "You brought her extra blankets," Lucas said. "Sat with her between your rounds. Made her laugh despite the pain. You even called her taxi when she was discharged, making sure the driver knew to help her into the house." Heat crept into Ellie's cheeks. "I was just doing my job." "No." Lucas's tone was firm. "You went far beyond that. Most of the staff treated her like any other patient, but you—" He paused, studying her face. "You treated her like she was your own mother." Ellie remembered that night, how the woman had reminded her of her own mother, how she'd hated seeing anyone alone in the ER. "I didn't know she was your mother. She never mentioned her last name." That's exactly why it mattered. Lucas pushed his plate aside. "You showed that kindness without knowing who she was, or what it might mean for you. After that night, I looked into your family. Found out about Michael's academic potential, about your father's struggling business. So, the scholarship—" Ellie's voice trailed off as understanding dawned. "Was my way of repaying that kindness." Lucas's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "My mother passed away last year, but she never forgot your compassion that night. She would have approved of—" He stopped abruptly, something vulnerable flickering across his face before his usual mask slipped back into place. Ellie sat back in her chair, her dinner forgotten. All this time, she'd thought Lucas Whitmore had chosen her family at random for his arrangement. But he'd been watching, remembering, repaying a kindness she'd long forgotten. A simple act of compassion had set in motion events that would eventually lead her here, to this very table. She looked at her husband with new eyes, wondering what other layers lay beneath his controlled exterior, what other memories and motivations had brought them to this moment. Scene 1. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen's bay windows, casting warm patches across the granite countertops. Ellie sat at the breakfast nook, wrapping her hands around a steaming mug of coffee. She'd taken to rising early, finding comfort in these quiet moments before the house fully woke. Lucas entered, already dressed in one of his impeccable suits. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, hurried to pour his coffee just the way he liked it. Black, no sugar. Ellie expected him to take it and retreat to his study as usual, but today was different. "How's your son doing, Mrs. Chen?" Lucas asked, accepting the cup. "He had that big chemistry test yesterday, didn't he?" The older woman's face lit up. "Oh yes, Mr. Whitmore. Tommy said it went well. Those extra tutoring sessions really helped." Ellie's ears perked up. She watched as Lucas nodded, a hint of satisfaction crossing his features. "Good. Make sure he knows the tutoring is available through college if he needs it." He glanced at his watch. "And don't forget, take whatever time you need for his graduation next month." Mrs. Chen beamed. "You're too kind, sir. I've already arranged coverage with Maria." As the housekeeper bustled away, Ellie noticed something she'd missed before: the way the staff moved around Lucas with ease, not fear. There was respect, certainly, but also a comfortable familiarity that spoke of long-standing care. Through breakfast, she observed more moments. Lucas asking George, the groundskeeper, about his wife's recovery from surgery, reminding Roberto, the chef, to take home extra groceries for his growing family, inquiring about Maria's grandmother in Puerto Rico. These weren't the hollow questions of an employer maintaining appearances. Lucas remembered details, followed up on previous conversations, showed genuine interest in their lives. Later that morning, Ellie overheard him on the phone in his study, the door left slightly ajar. "Yes, make sure the scholarship covers everything. Books, housing, meal plan," he was saying, "and set up the usual emergency fund. I don't want any of our employees' kids worried about money while they're trying to study." That evening, as Ellie sat cross-legged on her bed with her journal open, her pen hovered over the blank page. The house felt different now, as if she was seeing it through new eyes. The strict rules and formal atmosphere remained, but underneath ran currents of quiet generosity she'd never noticed before. She began to write. "Today I saw glimpses of another Lucas Whitmore, not the stern businessman who arranged our marriage, but someone who remembers his housekeeper's son's test dates and makes sure his staff's children can go to college. He hides his kindness behind efficiency, like he's afraid someone might notice he cares. I thought I knew what kind of man he was, the type who sees everything as a transaction, who bought himself a wife to solve a problem. But now I'm not so sure. The way he helped Michael all those years ago, how he takes care of his employees' families. There are layers to him I never expected. It scares me, this uncertainty. It was easier when I could put him in a neat box labeled Cold Billionaire. Now I find myself watching, wondering, trying to understand the man behind the carefully constructed walls. I'm still afraid of this arrangement, of him, of my own changing feelings, but tonight that fear shares space with something else. Curiosity about who Lucas Whitmore really is, beyond the contract that binds us. Dark clouds gathered outside the mansion's tall windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Ellie stood in the library, watching as sheets of rain began to fall. The storm had come suddenly, transforming the sunny afternoon into a gloomy tableau. "The forecast says it'll last through the evening," Lucas said from behind her, making her start slightly. She hadn't heard him enter. "I guess your meeting got canceled," Ellie asked, remembering he'd been scheduled to leave for downtown. "Can't risk driving in this." He loosened his tie, a surprisingly casual gesture for him. "The roads flood quickly in this part of town." Lightning flashed, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that made Ellie jump. The lights flickered ominously. "We should probably get some candles ready," she suggested, practical instincts kicking in. "Just in case." Lucas nodded, and they worked together in companionable silence, gathering emergency supplies from various cabinets. As they arranged candles and flashlights on the coffee table, another thunderclap shook the windows. "This reminds me of when I was little," Ellie said without thinking. "My mom used to make storm days special. We'd build blanket forts and tell stories until the rain stopped." She hadn't meant to share something so personal, but the memory had slipped out naturally. To her surprise, Lucas settled into one of the leather armchairs instead of retreating to his study. "What kind of stories?" he asked softly. Ellie sat on the couch, tucking her feet under her. "Usually fairy tales, but with silly twists, like Cinderella opening a shoe store or the three little pigs becoming architects." The corner of Lucas's mouth twitched. "Creative." "What about you?" she ventured. "Any storm day memories?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "My father's study had a window seat," he finally said. "On days like this, I'd hide there with my books. It felt like being in another world." "What did you read?" "Adventure stories, mostly. Jack London, Jules Verne." His voice grew softer. "My mother would sneak me cookies when father was busy with work." The lights flickered again and went out completely. In the dim gray light from the windows, Ellie could just make out Lucas's profile as he stood to light several candles. The warm glow created a cozy atmosphere that seemed to soften the formal room's edges. They talked more easily in the candlelight, sharing simple memories. Favorite childhood books, rainy day games, the comfort foods their mothers made. When Roberto appeared to announce dinner would be simple due to the power outage, they moved to the kitchen instead of the formal dining room. The chef had prepared sandwiches and soup that could be warmed on the gas stove. They ate by candlelight at the kitchen island, the storm still raging outside. The usual tension that marked their meals had eased, replaced by a gentle quiet, broken only by the patter of rain and occasional rumbles of thunder. Ellie noticed how Lucas seemed more relaxed here in the casual setting, his suit jacket draped over a nearby chair, shirt sleeves rolled up as he dipped his grilled cheese into tomato soup. Such an ordinary action for such an extraordinary man. The power remained out as they finished their simple dinner, but neither seemed inclined to move from the comfortable atmosphere they'd found in the candlelit kitchen. The silence between them had shifted from awkward to peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of the storm and the gentle flicker of flames. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Ellie surveyed the spacious room. After last night's casual dinner, she'd realized how cold and unused this beautiful space felt. Roberto, the chef, was arranging ingredients for lunch prep, his movements precise but lonely in the vast kitchen. "Roberto," Ellie said, "would you mind if I made some changes in here?" He looked up, surprised. "Changes, Mrs. Whitmore?" "Please, call me Ellie." She smiled warmly. "And yes, this kitchen feels too formal, like a restaurant instead of a home." Roberto's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing a hint of agreement. "What did you have in mind?" For the next hour, they rearranged cookware and reorganized cabinets. Maria, the housekeeper, joined them after finishing her morning duties. Together they moved the heavy center island to create a more open flow, added comfortable stools, and set up a coffee station where people could gather. "My mama always said a kitchen needs a soul," Maria shared as they worked, her usual reserve melting. "It should be the heart of the house." "Mine too," Ellie replied, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Help me with this shelf?" As they shifted furniture and swapped stories, other staff members drifted in. James, the gardener, offered suggestions for an herb garden in the window. Sarah, the junior housekeeper, knew the perfect spot for a message board where they could share notes and recipes. By lunchtime, The kitchen had transformed. Sunlight bounced off copper pots now hanging from a ceiling rack. Fresh flowers from James brightened the windowsill. The sterile perfection had given way to welcomed imperfection, a lived-in warmth that invited people to linger. Roberto insisted on making lunch for everyone as a celebration. Soon, the kitchen filled with the aroma of his famous paella, a recipe from his grandmother. Maria taught Ellie how to make proper tortillas, while Sarah shared stories about her culinary school adventures. Laughter bubbled up naturally as they worked and talked. The sound bounced off the walls, filling the once silent space with life. When Roberto's paella was ready, they gathered around the island, passing plates and sharing the meal family style. "I haven't enjoyed work this much in years," Maria admitted, her eyes twinkling. James nodded in agreement. "It's nice to feel like part of a family instead of just staff." The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by genuine laughter and warm smiles. They swapped childhood memories and kitchen disasters, each story drawing them closer together. None of them noticed Lucas standing in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. He observed how naturally Ellie had created this moment of connection, how she'd transformed his efficient but cold kitchen into something alive and welcoming. The sound of laughter, real, unrestrained joy, echoed through halls that hadn't heard such sounds since his mother passed away. Roberto was the first to spot him, starting to stand formally, but Ellie's gentle hand on his arm kept him seated. She met Lucas's eyes across the room, neither apologizing for nor defending the changes she'd made. The warmth in her gaze invited him to join them, to be part of this moment, rather than just observe it. Lucas remained in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. His staff relaxed and happy, the kitchen bright with sunshine and fellowship, and at the center of it all, his wife, who had somehow known exactly what his house had been missing all these years. The laughter continued, genuine and free, filling the mansion with a sound it had almost forgotten. It was the sound of home. The evening settled softly around the Whitmore mansion, wrapping it in gentle shadows. Ellie sat in the formal sitting room, her attention drawn to a silver-framed photograph on the mantel. The elegant woman in the image had Lucas's eyes and kind smile, a warmth that seemed to reach through time. She heard Lucas's footsteps before she saw him, now familiar with his measured pace. He paused in the doorway, his usual commanding presence softened by the room's dim lighting. "Your mother was beautiful," Ellie said quietly, gesturing to the photograph. "Would you tell me about her?" Lucas moved into the room, his steps slower than usual. He settled into the leather armchair across from her, his eyes fixed on the picture. "That was taken at our summer house in Maine," he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar gentleness. "She loved it there, said the ocean air made everything feel possible." Ellie waited, giving him space to continue. The grandfather clock in the corner marked time with soft ticks. "She was different from most people in our social circle," Lucas continued, loosening his tie slightly. "She grew up middle class in Ohio, met my father at college. Never quite fit in with the country club set. But she didn't try to. She was more interested in helping people than impressing them." His fingers traced the arm of the chair absently. "She volunteered at soup kitchens, literacy programs, anywhere she could make a difference. Father thought it was beneath her new status, but she just laughed it off, said money was only worth what you did with it." Ellie noticed how his usual rigid posture had softened, as if the memories themselves were changing him. "She sounds wonderful," she said softly. "She was." Lucas's voice grew quieter. "Even when she got sick, she kept volunteering as long as she could. Said other people's problems helped her forget her own." He stood suddenly, walking to the mantel. His fingers brushed the frame gently. The doctors gave her 6 months. She lived for 2 years, mostly through sheer determination. Wanted to see me graduate college. The room felt heavy with shared grief. Ellie remembered her own mother's passing, how the world seemed dimmer afterward. She made it to graduation, Lucas continued, his back still turned. Sat in the front row wearing this ridiculous bright yellow hat because she knew it would make me smile. 3 weeks later, his voice trailed off. Ellie moved quietly to stand near him, close enough to show support, but not so close as to intrude on his grief. That's why you helped Michael with his scholarship, isn't it? Because of her. Lucas nodded slowly. She always said education was the greatest gift you could give someone. When I saw you that day in the rain, helping a stranger without hesitation, you reminded me of her. The scholarship seemed like something she would have done. The sitting room fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence than usual. Not the strained quiet of their early days, but something deeper, more understanding. In the silver frame, Lucas's mother smiled out at them, her kind eyes holding secrets they were only beginning to share. "Thank you," Ellie said simply, "for telling me about her." Lucas remained still, his eyes fixed on his mother's photograph as he began to speak about her final days. The morning sun streamed through the breakfast room windows, casting warm squares of light across the polished table. Ellie stirred honey into her tea, watching the golden liquid swirl as she gathered her thoughts. After last night's conversation about Lucas's mother, something had shifted between them. A wall had lowered, if only slightly. Lucas sat across from her, scanning the morning paper with his usual intensity. But today, his shoulders seemed less tense, his presence less imposing. The vulnerability he'd shown the previous evening still lingered in the air between them. "I was thinking about what you shared last night," Ellie said softly, setting her spoon down. "About your mother's strength during her illness." Lucas looked up from his paper, his eyes meeting hers with quiet attention. "When my own mother passed," Ellie continued, her fingers wrapped around the warm teacup, "I was only 15. It felt like the world had stopped making sense. But faith kept me going." She paused, watching a bird land on the window feeder outside. "People sometimes think faith means you don't feel pain or doubt. But it's not that at all. It's more like having a light in the darkness. Even when you can barely see it, you know it's there." Lucas set his paper aside completely now, something he rarely did during breakfast. "How do you maintain that certainty?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity beneath its usual control. "It's not always certain," Ellie admitted, smiling gently. "There were days after Mom died when I was so angry, so lost. But I'd learned from her that faith isn't just about the good times. It's about trusting even when everything hurts." She took a sip of tea before continuing. "I remember sitting in church the Sunday after her funeral. Everyone was being so careful around us, like we might break. But during the hymns, I felt her presence, not physically but in my heart, like she'd left us a map to find peace, even if the journey was hard." Lucas's coffee sat cooling, forgotten, as he listened. "That must have helped with your father's situation, too, with the debt." Ellie nodded slowly. "It did. When everything was falling apart, when I felt most trapped, I would pray. Not for miracles or easy solutions, but for strength, for wisdom." She met his eyes steadily. "For the courage to do what needed to be done." Something flickered across Lucas's face. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "I envy that," he said quietly, surprising them both with his honesty. "After my mother died, I couldn't find comfort in faith. It felt empty, like prayers bouncing off the ceiling. "That's perfectly natural," Ellie replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Grief doesn't follow rules, and faith, real faith, can handle our anger, our questions." "My mother believed," Lucas said, almost to himself. "Like you do. Even at the end, she never lost that light you mentioned." He picked up his coffee cup, then set it down again without drinking. "I wanted to believe for her sake, but I couldn't pretend. It seemed easier to focus on what I could control: work, success, concrete things." "Yet you've honored her memory through kindness," Ellie observed. "The scholarship, your generosity to others, those are acts of faith, too, even if you don't call them that." Lucas looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Vulnerable, almost wistful. "I envy your certainty, Ellie, your ability to trust in something beyond yourself." The morning sun had climbed higher now, warming the room as they sat in companionable silence. Something had shifted again between them. A new understanding, fragile but real, built on shared grief and honest words. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Whitmore mansion as Ellie smoothed down her navy blue dress. It was simple but elegant, the kind of dress that didn't draw attention, but didn't fade into the background either. Just like her, she thought with a small smile. "The event starts at 7, Lucas said, appearing in the doorway of the sitting room. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. "It's just a small fundraiser for the Children's Hospital, mostly doctors and board members." Ellie nodded, trying to calm her nerves. This would be their first public appearance together since the wedding. "Will there be many people there?" "Maybe 50. Lucas adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous gesture she'd begun to recognize. "You don't have to come if you'd rather not." "No, I want to," she said quickly, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "It's a good cause, and—" She hesitated before adding softly, "I'd like to support you." Something flickered in Lucas's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. He offered her his arm as they walked to the waiting car, and Ellie noticed how naturally she fit beside him now. The venue was an intimate restaurant that had been closed for the private event. Warm lighting from crystal chandeliers created a welcoming atmosphere, and classical music played softly in the background. As they entered, Ellie felt Lucas's hand rest lightly on her lower back, a gesture that felt both protective and reassuring. "Lucas!" A silver-haired man approached them with a warm smile. "And this must be Ellie. I'm Dr. Thompson, Chief of Pediatrics." "It's lovely to meet you," Ellie said, immediately warming to his grandfatherly manner. Throughout the evening, Ellie watched Lucas interact with the hospital staff and donors. He listened intently to their stories, asked thoughtful questions, and spoke passionately about plans for new equipment and programs. This wasn't the cold businessman she'd first met. This was someone who genuinely cared about making a difference. During dinner, she found herself naturally joining the conversations, sharing her own experiences of community service and her brother's scholarship. The other guests responded warmly to her genuine interest and compassion. "Your wife is a natural at this," she overheard Dr. Thompson tell Lucas. "She has that rare gift of making everyone feel heard." Later, as soft music played, Lucas turned to her. "Would you like to dance?" Ellie hesitated only a moment before nodding. As they moved to the small dance floor, she felt his hand settle at her waist, warm and steady. They began to sway to the music, and she was surprised by how easily they found their rhythm together. "Thank you for coming tonight," Lucas said quietly. His voice meant only for her. "You've made quite an impression." "They're wonderful people," Ellie replied. "And the work they're doing, it matters so much." As they danced, Ellie realized something had changed. The awkward distance between them had dissolved into something more comfortable, more real. She wasn't just playing a role anymore. She was genuinely sharing this moment with him. The evening wound down naturally, with warm goodbyes and promises to return for future events. In the car ride home, Ellie sat close enough to Lucas that their shoulders almost touched, both of them content in the comfortable silence. Back at the mansion, as they walked up the grand staircase together, Ellie felt a deep sense of rightness settle over her. This was no longer just Lucas's world that she was observing from the outside. She had found her own place within it, a place where she could make a difference alongside him. The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows as Ellie prepared her usual cup of tea. 1 month. She could hardly believe 30 days had passed since she'd walked into this mansion as Lucas's wife. The house no longer felt as imposing as it once had. Its grand room softened by small touches she'd added: fresh flowers, family photos, and the constant aroma of home cooking. She noticed Lucas was acting differently today. He kept checking his phone, disappearing into his study for brief calls, and giving her quick, almost nervous glances when he thought she wasn't looking. Typically, he'd be buried in work by now, but today he seemed distracted. Mrs. Whitmore, Maria, their housekeeper, approached with an unusually bright smile. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to tell you he'll be home for dinner tonight. He specifically requested you don't cook anything." Ellie's eyebrows rose in surprise. Lucas rarely made such requests, usually content to eat whatever she prepared, or often missing dinner entirely due to work. Did he say why? "No, ma'am," Maria replied, but her eyes twinkled with poorly concealed knowledge. Throughout the day, Ellie noticed more unusual activity. Deliveries arrived. Flowers, wine, and what looked like grocery bags whisked quickly to the kitchen. The staff moved with purpose, sharing knowing looks that made her both curious and slightly anxious. At precisely 6 o'clock, Lucas appeared in the doorway of their sitting room, where Ellie had been reading. He'd changed into a fresh shirt and dark slacks, his usual business attire replaced by something more casual but still elegant. "Would you join me for dinner?" he asked, extending his hand. Ellie took it, noting how natural this gesture had become. He led her to the mansion's smaller dining room, the one they used when it was just the two of them. The space had been transformed. Candles flickered on the table, and the scent of garlic and herbs filled the air. "Lucas," she breathed, taking in the intimate setting. "Did you do all this?" He shifted slightly, almost embarrassed. "I had help, but I wanted to mark the occasion. 1 month isn't long, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It feels significant." The dinner was simple but perfectly prepared. Pasta with fresh seafood, crusty bread, and a light wine. Lucas had remembered her mentioning once that she preferred simpler meals to elaborate ones. The fact that he'd paid attention to such a small detail touched her deeply. "I hope this is okay," he said, watching her reaction. "I know we didn't start this marriage in the usual way, but I wanted to acknowledge how much has changed, how much better this house feels with you here." Ellie felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." They talked easily through dinner, sharing stories about their day, discussing plans for the children's hospital fundraiser, and even laughing about Maria's terrible attempts at being subtle about the surprise. The tension that had marked their early days together had melted into something more comfortable, more genuine. After dinner, Lucas suggested they take their coffee in his study, something that had become a pleasant habit on the evenings he was home. As they entered the warmly lit room, Ellie's eyes were drawn to his desk, where a legal file lay open. Her heart skipped a beat as she glimpsed familiar letterhead, the same law firm that had handled their marriage contract. The file was partially covered by other papers, but she could clearly see her name printed at the top. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight as Ellie sat cross-legged on her bed, hands trembling as she held the documents she'd taken from Lucas's study. She hadn't meant to snoop, but after he'd been called away for an urgent business call, the file had practically called out to her. Now, in the soft glow of her bedside lamp, the truth lay exposed in cold, legal language. Her eyes moved across the papers, each word hitting her like a physical blow. The debt, her father's debt that had started all of this, had been purchased by Lucas months before he'd ever proposed the marriage. Not just purchased, but deliberately acquired from multiple lenders, consolidated under his control. "No," she whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Please, no." But the documents continued their merciless revelation. There, in precise legal terms, was a plan for annulment, drafted before they'd even married. The marriage had never been meant to last beyond a few months, just long enough to satisfy some legal requirement about the debt forgiveness. Then a clean break would follow. Ellie's chest felt tight as she remembered all the small moments that had seemed so meaningful, the shared meals, the quiet conversations, the way he'd remembered her helping his mother years ago. Had it all been part of some elaborate plan? A way to make the temporary arrangement more bearable? She pulled out another document, this one detailing the exact timeline. 3 months. That's all it was supposed to be. They were already 1 month in, which meant in just 8 weeks, Lucas planned to end everything. The life she'd begun to build here, the warmth she'd started to feel, the connection she'd thought was growing. It was all scheduled to disappear. The night stretched on as Ellie pored over every detail, hoping to find something, anything that might contradict what she was reading. Instead, she found only more evidence of careful planning. Lucas had orchestrated everything, down to the smallest detail. Her fingers traced over his signature at the bottom of one page, remembering how just hours ago those same hands had pulled out her chair at dinner, had gestured animatedly as he told her about his day. How could he have sat across from her, sharing meals and conversations, all while knowing this was temporary? The eastern sky began to lighten, pale gray seeping into the darkness. Ellie moved to her window seat, watching as dawn slowly painted the garden in weak light. The roses she'd planted last week were just starting to bloom. Roses she'd thought would be here for years to come, marking this as her home. A sob caught in her throat as the full weight of reality settled over her. She'd done more than just agree to this marriage. She'd begun to believe in it. Despite its unusual beginning, she'd allowed herself to hope that something real was growing between them. But while she'd been falling for the quiet businessman who remembered small kindnesses and cared deeply for others, he'd been following a carefully crafted exit strategy. The first birds began their morning songs as Ellie wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold together a heart that felt like it was breaking apart. The morning light that usually brought her such hope now seemed to mock her with its cheerfulness. In the growing brightness, she could see the truth with painful clarity. She was never meant to be Lucas Whitmore's wife. She was just another business transaction, scheduled for completion in 2 months' time. Ellie moved through the mansion like a ghost in the early morning light. Her steps were quiet, deliberate, as she gathered her belongings from the closet and drawers that had briefly been hers. She folded each item with care. The simple dresses she'd brought from home, the few new pieces she'd acquired during her stay, placing them methodically in her old suitcase. The household staff wouldn't arrive for another hour. Lucas had left at dawn for an early meeting, his departure marked by the familiar sound of his car crunching down the gravel driveway. He'd knocked softly on her door before leaving, as he'd started doing recently, but she'd pretended to be asleep. In the bathroom, she collected her modest toiletries, leaving behind the expensive creams and perfumes Lucas had provided. They weren't really hers, just like this life hadn't really been hers. Her fingers brushed against the silver-backed hairbrush on the vanity, a gift he'd given her last week. After a moment's hesitation, she left it behind, too. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, catching dust motes in its beam as Ellie moved from room to room. She paused in the sitting room where they'd shared so many evening conversations. The photograph of Lucas's mother still sat on the side table, her kind eyes seeming to follow Ellie as she crossed the room. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the photograph. "I really did try to help him." At her small writing desk, the one Lucas had moved into the library so she'd have a quiet place to write letters, Ellie pulled out a sheet of paper. The pen felt heavy in her hand as she began to write. "Dear Lucas, I found the annulment papers in your study. I understand now that this arrangement was meant to be temporary from the start. You should have told me. I would have played my part better if I'd known not to let my heart get involved. Thank you for your kindness to my family, and for the courtesy you've shown me during my stay. I'm choosing to leave now, rather than wait for the planned ending. It seems kinder to us both this way. Please proceed with the annulment, as you intended. I won't contest it. Ellie." She folded the note carefully, writing his name on the outside. After a moment's thought, she placed it beside his mother's photograph, where she knew he would find it when he returned home. Her old suitcase wasn't heavy. She hadn't brought much to begin with, and she was leaving with even less. Some things, like the hope she'd started to feel, couldn't be packed away. Standing in the grand foyer one last time, Ellie looked up at the crystal chandelier that had so intimidated her on that first day. Now it just looked sad, casting rainbow reflections on the marble floor. The morning air was crisp as she stepped outside, closing the heavy front door behind her with a quiet click. The rose bushes she'd planted swayed gently in the breeze, their buds just beginning to open. Someone else would get to see them bloom. Ellie walked down the long driveway, her sensible shoes making little noise on the gravel. She didn't look back at the mansion. She'd learned long ago that looking back only made hard things harder. Instead, she kept her eyes forward, focused on putting one foot in front of the other, maintaining the dignity that was all she had left to hold on to. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the familiar walkway as Ellie approached her childhood home. The small house, with its weathered paint and crooked shutters, had never looked more welcoming. She paused at the bottom of the front steps, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Frank Hart sat in his usual chair by the window, reading his worn Bible. He looked up at the sound of footsteps, his eyes widening at the sight of his daughter standing there with her old suitcase. The moment their eyes met, his face fell. He knew something was wrong. "Ellie?" He set his Bible aside, rising quickly despite his bad knee. "What happened, sweetheart?" She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "I'm home, Daddy." Frank rushed to open the door, taking her suitcase as she stepped inside. The familiar scent of coffee and old wood wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The faded cushions on the couch, the family photos on the walls, even the stack of Michael's school books on the coffee table. "Sit down, honey." Frank guided her to the couch, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "Let me get you some water." "I'm fine," Ellie said automatically, but her voice cracked on the words. Frank disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with a glass of water and concern etched deep in his face. He sat beside her, waiting as she took small sips. Did Lucas hurt you?" Frank's voice was tight with barely contained anger. Ellie shook her head quickly. "No, nothing like that. She set the glass down, her hands shaking slightly. I found some papers in his study, legal documents about the marriage. Frank's face paled. What kind of documents? He'd planned it all from the beginning, Ellie said quietly. The marriage, the debt, everything. He bought the debt before he ever made the offer. And he... She swallowed hard. He already had annulment papers drawn up. This was never meant to last. Frank slumped back against the couch, the color draining from his face. His hands twisted together in his lap, a nervous habit Ellie hadn't seen since she was a child. "Oh, Ellie," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, I'm so very sorry." She looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw the guilt weighing heavy on his shoulders. "Daddy, what do you mean?" Frank's eyes filled with tears. "I knew," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I knew he'd bought the debt. He came to me first, before making the offer. Said he had a proposal that could help us all, but I had to let him handle it his way." The revelation hit Ellie like a physical blow. "You knew, all this time?" "He said he'd clear the debt, either way, but that he wanted a chance to know you. Said he remembered your kindness to his mother." Frank reached for her hand, but Ellie pulled away. I hoped maybe something real could grow from it. I never meant for you to get hurt." "You let me walk into this blind," Ellie whispered. "You watched me struggle with the decision, knowing all along." "I was ashamed," Frank said, tears now flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. "Ashamed of my debt, ashamed of putting you in that position. Please, Ellie, please forgive me. I thought I was protecting you, giving you a chance at something better than this." He gestured at their modest surroundings. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." Ellie sat in silence, her father's words washing over her. The betrayal cut deep. Not just Lucas's careful manipulation, but her own father's willing participation in it. Yet as she watched Frank weeping beside her, she felt her heart crack in a different way. Here was the man who had raised her alone after her mother died, who had worked countless overtime hours to keep food on their table, who had always put his children first. The evening shadows stretched long across the Whitmore mansion's manicured lawn as Lucas's car pulled into the circular driveway. He loosened his tie, exhausted from a day of meetings, but feeling lighter than he had in years. The house looked different now, warmer somehow, despite its imposing facade. Ellie had brought life back into these cold halls. The front door opened silently at his touch. "Ellie?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty foyer. No response. The usual sounds of life, quiet humming from the kitchen, soft footsteps upstairs, were absent. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Maria, their housekeeper, appeared from the kitchen, wringing her hands. "Sir, she left earlier today. There's a note in your study." Lucas felt his stomach drop. He strode quickly to his study, his footsteps too loud in the sudden silence. On his desk, a single sheet of paper lay carefully centered on the polished wood. He recognized Ellie's neat handwriting immediately. "Dear Lucas," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "I found the documents about the debt purchase and the planned annulment. I understand now that this marriage was never meant to be real, that it was all carefully orchestrated from the beginning. Your kindness these past weeks makes more sense. Guilt, perhaps, or pity." He sank into his leather chair, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. "I won't pretend I'm not hurt," the letter continued. "Not by the arrangement itself. I knew what I was agreeing to when I signed those papers, but I thought we were both finding our way through this honestly, however awkward or difficult. I didn't realize I was the only one who didn't know the full story." Lucas closed his eyes, remembering her face that day in the rain years ago, how she'd helped his mother without hesitation or expectation. He'd wanted to recreate that moment of pure kindness, to understand the person capable of such genuine compassion. Instead, he'd turned it into a business transaction. I'm grateful for your generosity, to my family, to Michael's education, to me. But I can't stay in a marriage built on half-truths, no matter how well-intentioned. You don't need to worry about the annulment papers. I'll sign them whenever you're ready. The letter was signed simply, Ellie. Lucas set the paper down carefully, as if it might crumble under his touch. The study, once his favorite room in the house, felt suffocating. Every surface held memories of their conversations, her perched on the edge of his desk as they discussed their days, her curled in the leather armchair reading while he worked, her genuine interest in his mother's photographs. He'd planned everything so carefully. Buy the debt, offer the marriage, show her kindness, give her time to adjust, let her see the real him. But in his meticulous planning, he'd forgotten the most important thing: trust. He'd asked for her honesty while withholding his own. The mansion's silence pressed in around him. No soft footsteps in the hallway, no quiet humming from the kitchen, no gentle voice asking about his day. Just emptiness, heavier than before because now he knew what he was missing. Lucas picked up the letter again, running his thumb over her signature. He'd thought he was protecting her by controlling the situation, giving her time to adapt before revealing the full truth. Instead, his careful manipulation had cost him the very thing he'd hoped to gain: her genuine trust and affection. The morning sun cast long shadows across the modest Hart family home, as Lucas's luxury car seemed oddly out of place in the humble neighborhood. He sat behind the wheel for several minutes, his usual confidence stripped away, leaving only raw vulnerability. With trembling fingers, he straightened his tie, a nervous habit he thought he'd outgrown years ago. The perfectly tailored suit that normally felt like armor now seemed to suffocate him. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed a sleepless night spent pacing his empty mansion. Finally, he stepped out of the car and walked up the worn path to the front door. Each step felt heavier than the last. Before he could knock, the door opened, and Frank Hart stood there, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. "Mr. Whitmore," Frank said quietly, guilt evident in his voice. "I suppose I should have expected you'd come." "Is she here?" Lucas asked, his voice hoarse. "I need to speak with her." Frank hesitated, then nodded toward the backyard. "She's in the garden." It's where she goes to think." Lucas walked around the house, following the narrow gravel path. He found Ellie kneeling among her mother's old flower beds, pulling weeds with focused determination. She wore old jeans and a faded t-shirt, so different from the elegant clothes he'd insisted on buying her, yet somehow more beautiful in her authenticity. She looked up at his approach, her hands stilling in the soil. "Lucas." Her voice was steady, but he could see the hurt in her eyes. "I brought the annulment papers," he said, holding up a manila envelope, "but not for the reasons you think." Ellie stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. "You don't need to explain. I understand business arrangements." "No," Lucas interrupted, his carefully prepared speech crumbling. "You don't understand at all. I've been trying to control everything, just like I always do. The debt, the marriage, the timing. I thought I could manage it all perfectly." He ran a hand through his usually immaculate hair. "But I couldn't control falling in love with you." Ellie's breath caught, but she remained silent. "That day you helped my mother in the rain. I've never forgotten it. Your kindness wasn't calculated or conditional. It was pure and real." Lucas took a step closer. "I thought if I could just create the right circumstances, give you time to know me, maybe you could feel something genuine for me too. But I did everything wrong. I tried to orchestrate love instead of earning it honestly. He held out the envelope. These papers are yours to do with, as you choose. No conditions, no expectations. I'm not here to manipulate or negotiate. I'm here to tell you that I love you, not because of any arrangement, but because you brought warmth back into my life. You showed me what faith really means. You made my house feel like a home for the first time since my mother died. Lucas placed the envelope on a nearby garden bench. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know the truth, all of it this time. The annulment is yours if you want it, and if you don't. He swallowed hard. If you don't, I promise to spend every day earning back your trust with complete honesty. He stood there, more vulnerable than he'd ever allowed himself to be, waiting for her response. The morning breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the sweet scent of the flowers Ellie's mother had planted so many years ago. In that moment, all his wealth and power meant nothing. He was simply a man hoping for a second chance at love. Sunlight filtered through the faded curtains of Ellie's childhood bedroom, casting familiar patterns on the worn quilt her mother had made. She knelt beside her bed, just as she had countless times before, seeking guidance in prayer. Lord, she whispered, her fingers intertwined tightly, I need your wisdom now more than ever. The quiet afternoon wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket. Downstairs, she could hear the gentle creaking of floorboards as her father moved about the kitchen. The sounds of home, so different from the pristine silence of the Whitmore mansion. Ellie's eyes fell on the small cross hanging on her wall, the same one that had watched over her through every joy and heartache. I'm scared, she admitted softly. Not of Lucas anymore, but of trusting again, of believing in something that started with deception. She rose and walked to her window, looking out at the garden where Lucas had stood hours earlier. His words echoed in her mind, not the polished, controlled speeches she'd grown used to, but raw, honest vulnerability. She'd seen something in his eyes she'd never witnessed before. Pure fear. Fear of losing her. Crossing to her dresser, Ellie picked up an old photo of her mother. What would you tell me to do, Mom? She traced her mother's smile with her finger. You always said love was a choice we make every day, that it's not just about feelings, but about choosing to see the best in someone, even when it's hard. The afternoon light shifted, and Ellie caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked different somehow, stronger, yet softer. The past months had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The truth is, she spoke aloud, setting down the photo, I didn't just make his house a home. He gave me a home too. Not the building, but the feeling of belonging, of being seen. She smiled slightly, remembering quiet conversations over coffee, shared glances across dinner tables, and the gradual warming of cold spaces between them. Moving back to kneel at her bedside, Ellie closed her eyes. Lord, I think I understand now. Sometimes love grows in unexpected places, even from difficult beginnings. You can turn anything into something beautiful if we let you. She thought about Lucas's words in the garden, not just his confession of love, but his willingness to let her go. The man who had once demanded control through contracts was now offering freedom without conditions. That transformation spoke louder than any words could. Standing decisively, Ellie smoothed her dress and took a deep breath. Love is a choice, she repeated her mother's words, and today I choose to believe in second chances. She descended the stairs, finding her father reading in his favorite chair. He looked up, immediately recognizing the resolved expression on her face, the same one her mother used to wear when she'd made an important decision. You're going back, he said. It wasn't a question. Ellie nodded. Not because I have to, Dad. Because I want to. Because sometimes love means choosing to trust again, even when it's scary. Frank stood and hugged her tightly. Your mother would be proud of the woman you've become, sweetheart. Go show him what real love looks like. With renewed purpose, Ellie gathered her things and stepped out onto the front porch. The afternoon sun warmed her face as she began walking toward the Whitmore mansion, each step feeling right in a way she couldn't explain. She wasn't going back to a contract or an arrangement. She was choosing to build something real with the man who had finally learned to lead with his heart instead of his wallet. Morning sunlight dappled through the rose arbor in the Whitmore mansion's garden, where chairs had been arranged in intimate clusters. Unlike the sterile courthouse ceremony 2 months ago, today's gathering hummed with warmth and anticipation. Garden staff had outdone themselves, with white roses and baby's breath creating delicate arches along the pathways. Margaret Whitmore, usually reserved, moved among the small group of guests with uncharacteristic animation, adjusting flower arrangements and straightening tablecloths. The elderly housekeeper had told Ellie just yesterday how she hadn't seen the garden looking this alive since Lucas's mother passed. It's like the house is breathing again, Margaret whispered to Ellie as she helped her with final preparations. And it's all because of you, dear. Michael, looking sharp in his new suit, couldn't stop grinning as he helped Frank with his tie near the garden entrance. You should have seen Lucas practicing his vows last night, he confided to their father. Never thought I'd see a billionaire that nervous? Ellie watched from the French doors leading to the garden, her simple white dress catching the morning breeze. This time there were no lawyers present, no contracts to sign. Just family, a few close friends, and the house staff who'd become like family over the past months. Lucas stood beneath the rose arbor, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. Gone was the rigid posture and guarded expression. Instead, he shifted from foot to foot, occasionally reaching up to loosen his tie, until Margaret swatted his hand away with grandmotherly authority. Ready? Frank appeared at Ellie's side, offering his arm. His eyes were misty as he looked at his daughter. More than ready, Ellie replied, taking her father's arm. This time feels real. They walked down the garden path as Margaret began playing the piano. The music wasn't perfectly executed like a professional musician might deliver, but its heartfelt quality matched the occasion perfectly. Lucas's face softened as Ellie approached, and she could see his hands trembling slightly. So different from their first ceremony, where he'd stood like a statue, emotionless and distant. Now his eyes were bright with unshed tears. When they reached the arbor, Frank placed Ellie's hand in Lucas's, and this time the gesture wasn't a business transaction. It was a father entrusting his daughter's heart to the man she'd chosen to love. 2 months ago, Lucas began, his voice rough with emotion. I thought I could control love like I control my companies. I was wrong. He squeezed Ellie's hands gently. You taught me that real love isn't about power or protection. It's about trust and truth and choosing each other every day. Ellie's voice wavered as she responded. I came to your house as part of a contract, but I'm staying because of love. You've shown me that even when something begins broken, God can make it whole. The small gathering watched as Lucas and Ellie exchanged new rings, simple bands that meant more than all the expensive jewelry he'd originally offered. These rings weren't symbols of ownership or obligation, but of choice and commitment. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Frank held Michael's shoulder tightly. The garden itself seemed to glow in the morning light, as if nature itself was blessing this genuine union. When they sealed their vows with a kiss, it wasn't the polite peck from their courthouse ceremony. This kiss held promise and passion, tempered by hard-earned wisdom and trust. They had learned that love couldn't be bought or sold. It had to be built, day by day, choice by choice. The Hart family home glowed with fresh paint in the late afternoon sun. Gone were the worn shutters and creaking steps, though Ellie had insisted on keeping the porch swing where she'd spent so many evenings in prayer. Lucas had personally overseen the renovations, making sure to preserve the home's character while fixing its hurting places. "Can you believe it?" Michael bounded down the stairs, waving his acceptance letter. "Full scholarship to medical school." His tie hung loose around his neck as he prepared for his high school graduation ceremony later that evening. Ellie smiled from the kitchen, where she was arranging a platter of sandwiches. The familiar space now sported new countertops and appliances, but the heart of the home remained unchanged. "I always knew you could do it," she said, reaching out to fix his tie. "Mom would be so proud." Frank sat in his restored leather armchair, looking years younger without the weight of debt on his shoulders. "Your mother always said Michael had healing hands," he remembered softly. "Even as a little boy, he knew how to make things better." Lucas appeared in the doorway, his suit jacket draped over one arm. These days he spent more time in casual clothes than business wear, having learned to delegate more at work. "The car's ready whenever everyone is," he announced, then smiled as Margaret hustled in with a homemade cake for after the ceremony. "I still can't believe you're letting me retire in the guest house," Margaret said, setting down her creation. After decades of service to the Whitmore family, she'd become more grandmother than housekeeper. "Letting you?" Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You practically had to be bribed to accept it." His tone was warm, playful. A far cry from the cold businessman who'd once arranged a marriage by contract. Ellie watched her blended family with quiet joy. The past months hadn't been perfect. They'd had their share of arguments and adjustments, but they'd faced each challenge together, with honest hearts and genuine love. The evening sun painted everything golden as they prepared to leave for the graduation. Michael fidgeted with his cap. Frank gathered his camera, and Margaret fussed over last-minute details. "Ready?" Lucas asked, offering Ellie his arm. She paused, taking in the scene. Her childhood home restored but not remade. Her father happy and healthy, her brother heading toward his dreams. And beside her, a husband who'd learned that love was stronger than control, and faith more valuable than fortune. "Ready," she answered, slipping her hand into his. They walked together toward the car, where their family waited. The future stretched before them, not as a carefully controlled business plan, but as an adventure in trust and shared faith. Michael's laughter rang out as Frank told an old story. Margaret called out last-minute instructions about the cake, and Ellie leaned into Lucas's shoulder, grateful for the journey that had brought them here, not to a perfectly polished ending, but to a real beginning, built on choice and grace and love. Their steps fell into sync as they walked. Two people who had learned that the strongest bonds aren't forged by contracts or obligation, but by daily choices to love, forgive, and grow together. The evening light wrapped around them like a blessing as they moved forward, surrounded by the family they'd built together.